Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We're going to give a shout out there to the people who decided to take up the hobby of gardening. I mean, after all, we're living in a more sustainable world where people are more inclusive about what they decide to do when it comes to, for instance, growing their own food. Get away from them nasty GMOs. But maybe for a lot of us, we just don't have the kind of room that others have when it comes to having that backyard area that we plot out to be able to take on this endeavor. Well, perhaps we might want to take on something that you're going to be very intrigued about today, which is something known as keyhole gardening. Our guest today has been involved in what is known as keyhole gardening for more than 10 years now, and his company, Keyhole Farm, manufactures what are known as keyhole garden kits. He's an avid gardener who likes to educate about the practice of keyhole gardening and prefers this method because it's easier on the back. Hey, that's a plus. Plant crops can be grown close together, water efficient, and doesn't require weeding. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and keyhole gardener extraordinaire, Mr. W. Leon Smith. Mr. Smith, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Glad to be here. Nice to talk to you.
Now, I understand you actually created the system. Is that that what happened here?
No, not really.
Not entirely. Okay.
it got its start in Lesotho, Africa. There was a school there that, for some reason, came up with the idea of building a circular-shaped raised bed area to raise crops for students. In this particular area, I think they had problems with not enough rain at times and too much rain at other times. But if you had a garden area that you could control, then you could have year-round crops. And so they're the ones that invented the system. I got involved in it after I talked to a woman named Deb Tolman, Dr. Deb Tolman. She lives close to where I live here in Clifton, Texas, and I used to publish the local newspaper, and she wrote columns for me about gardening and things like that. And she did one about keyhole gardening and gave a diagram of how to build one. So I decided, okay, I'd like to have one of those. I had done gardening previously on the ground, had a big area that I plowed every year and dropped seeds in and raised some pretty good crops. But I had gotten out of that for a while. Anyway, I wanted to build my own keyhole garden. So I had some rocks, and so I hauled them over to an area of the yard and started to figure out how I was going to build this thing. And I ran out of rocks, so I went and got some cinder blocks and ended up with a keyhole garden based upon the way she said they should be built. And the first year I had excellent crops, so I wanted another one. And I did not want to have to go through the process of hauling these heavy rocks and trying to fit them into place and all that. And so my brother and I decided we would experiment some and try to come up with a way of building one that was lightweight and easier to put together and everything. So that's when we came up with our keyhole garden made from a kit. And for a while, we just built them for ourselves and for friends, but people kept wanting them, so eventually it turned into a small business. But that's how I got into it, and that's where the keyhole garden concept came from, was Africa.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Now, let's talk about, for instance, besides the fact that it sounds like it saves on your back, what the advantages of a keyhole garden are.
Well, there are a lot of advantages. Like you say, the back element is extremely important, especially when you get up in years. I just turned 65, and I would never go back to gardening on the ground. But there are other reasons, too. One is that you really conserve a lot of water. And another is that you control the soil. And it is easy on the back. And you can plant your seeds closer together than you would in a regular ground garden because you're constantly feeding it with your internal basket that you throw leftovers into, like veggie cuttings and banana peels, things like that, coffee grinds, things like that. So the one thing that I think is pretty important is the garden needs to be circular in shape. I know there are places out there right now that are suggesting that, a keyhole garden can be square-shaped or rectangular, but they really need to be in a circular shape for the hydraulics to work correctly with the flow from the internal basket. So another advantage is you can get right up to your crops and do it in a standing fashion instead of having to bend over so much. And it's just really easy to work the gardens. That's the type of advantage I'm talking about.
Now, what kind of procedures should a person follow when they're preparing a keyhole garden bed?
Keyhole garden beds are generally best done by layering, like you would. What I do with mine is I start off with cardboard, like you find, like with cardboard boxes, that are carbon-based. And what I do is I'll take them out and tear them to the right size and wet them down and stick them down into the garden bed and build them up, probably around halfway usually. A lot of that depends on what I have handy as far as cardboard goes. But that also includes like old phone books, magazines, newspapers. You can use any kind of paper product, but cardboard is what I usually try to key on. Then I'll layer in some brush, like if I have any twigs, things like that, leaves, dried leaves. And I do have one layer I usually put in that consists of what I consider to be green material, which would be, like coffee grinds, tea bags, green leaves, things like that. Certain types of manure work as green. And then I'll end up usually at the top putting dried leaves on all the way to the top. And I'll kind of mash down on it. And then I will start putting in some type of compost or topsoil. And usually it weighs down the leaves and makes them, go flatter, but also it falls into the nooks and crannies. I build it up to the top with that. Then I water it down good and leave it overnight and go back the next morning and it will have sunk somewhat. So I put some more compost on the top and then I plant the seeds. That's how I do mine usually. I vary that occasionally experimentally, but that's how I do it.
Now, do you also tend to germinate the seeds before planting them?
Sometimes I do. Usually in the wintertime, I get really anxious wanting to, start my plants for spring as early as I can. I usually do it too early, just out of desire to get into doing that. But the way I germinate my seeds is to use the paper towel method, where you get a paper towel and you fold it in half. And then on half of that half, you put seeds in, just spread them out. Then you fold the other half on top of it. Then you wet it down with water. You put it in the Ziploc bag, get the air out and seal it, and put it in a dry place or a warm place. And usually within 24 hours, like with black-eyed peas, you have germination. Now, the key to this is the water that's put on there is carbonated water. In years past, I've used just plain tap water, and it seems like it takes forever for seeds to germinate. But with carbonated water, it goes fast because, for one thing, seeds and plants crave carbon. The way I do it is, a few years ago, one of my daughters gave me a Christmas present that was a soda stream machine, to make your own soft drinks with.
Right.
And you pump your carbonation into the water. And I thought, well, I'm just going to try this out. And I did. I couldn't believe how fast everything germinated. Like green beans usually germinate within 36 hours, as does okra. And just, it goes a lot quicker. Corn germinates quick. But that's what I do as far as germinating seeds in advance, although the majority of my gardens usually consist of just seeds that are not germinated. I try to get a head start on black-eyed peas because if you plant those too early, the seeds kind of tend to rot. And but if you germinate them in advance, they don't. And a lot of times I'm picking black-eyed peas at the time I would normally be just planting them. So there are advantages to germination.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that you had created, I guess, a retractable cover for raised bed gardens. Talk about what that is and how it works.
Well, every year, I try to get a head start on getting my seeds put out in the garden. And here in Texas, anyway, you end up with weird weather. Like you think, okay, the last freeze has happened, and then 2 or 3 weeks later you have a big freeze. And if you have stuff planted, you have to cover it, or you lose your plants. So every year, just about, I've come up with new ideas and ways to cover the gardens without just throwing cloths on top of them. Because if you have heavy winds, they'll blow the cloths around, and you're mashing your plants and all that. So this year I came up with the bright idea that what if I had a retractable cover, one that would lay flat on the ground on one side, you lift it up over the entire plant like a igloo almost looking, and tie it down on the other side, and that way you have a kind of a dome over your garden. And you're not even touching any of your plants in doing this, and it's easy to put on and easy to take off. And I did it during a windy season to be sure that the wind wouldn't blow it or anything like that. It worked great. So on our website, I've got a couple of videos, and I did a how-to. When I built it, I utilized materials and parts that you can readily get at a convenience, at a hardware store, and it uses half-inch PVC pipe and couplings and just things that you can easily get. And so I did a how-to so people can build their own if they want to. And mine is working great. What I did a smaller version initially for one of our smaller keyhole gardens. We do 2 sizes. One is with a 42-inch diameter, and one is the regular 6-foot. I did the 42-inch with the cover, and it worked great. So then I did a freeze cover for the 6-foot, and it did great. And I added an extra one that's even taller and bigger that has netting on it, so that if you want to keep birds away from your tomatoes and certain crops, it does a good job of that. It uses deer netting. And so it's working out pretty good. I advise the people who are interested just to go to our website and look at it and see what they think.
Now, let's talk about the kits that you're talking about here. What they are. Are they different sizes? Because you got to consider sometimes too. Maybe people don't exactly entirely have a whole lot of room. Perhaps
right.
Even a 1-bedroom apartment. You never know, but they want to get into something like this. How does all that work?
Well, the official size of Keyhole Gardens is the 6-foot diameter with a wedge kind of cut out, and then a basket that's a 12-inch diameter wire basket in the middle. If you look at it from a bird's eye view, it looks like an old keyhole. That's where it gets its name. But we had some people, I guess it's been about 3 years ago, that kept asking us if we had a smaller version of it, and we didn't. So I decided, well, why not design one? So I did. It's circular in shape, but it does not have the wedge cut out because you can reach the internal basket all the way around it. And it's 42 inches in diameter. The keyhole gardens ours are like 28 3/4 inches tall. The internal basket sets up a little bit taller at about 36 inches. And ours consist of a metal frame that, has rails that go around it to hold the panels in place. And that's really about all there is to it. They don't weigh that much. They're very lightweight. The first one that I built is still in operation, and it's been probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's doing fine. So they hold up pretty well. Ours consist of the sides being ridged polycarbonate, UV protected. The company that manufactures those says it's safe for what we're using them for. They're originally made as roofing panels. And they come in 3 colors, forest green, castle gray, and red brick. But that's what we do. People order them and we ship them to them.
Very good. Now, what are the advantages? Obviously, we talked earlier about, this is really easy on the back, but, about having these gardens for people who might be over the age of 50.
Yeah. When I very first got into this, I really was sold on the fact that you can raise big crops in a very small space. It's almost a perfect gardening system. And, to me that was a huge advantage, plus the fact that you conserve water. You're not watering areas that don't need to be watered. But it's even more so with me now because I am older. I'm, 65, and I have a torn ACL in one of my knees, and it's just hard to get down on your hands and knees and work gardens like that. So it's just really nice. And the thing about our kits is, with the thinner walls around them, you save about 8 inches that you would with rocks and cinder blocks of reachability. And so you can get really right up to your plants and work them. And they're pretty much ADA type compliant. So, we've had children, plant our gardens with us. I had some Girl Scouts come out. It's been about 2 or 3 years ago. And they had a Feed the World program that they were involved in. And they decided they wanted to, get involved in helping plant my keyhole gardens. Well, when they first got here, they were afraid to get their fingers dirty. They were afraid of worms. They were afraid of, they just were kind of skittish about it. But by the end of the day, they were telling me what to do. They were saying, hey, why don't you plant this here? Why don't you plant this here? And usually they were pretty right. They were reading the seed packets and all that. And a couple of weeks later, when the plants started coming up, some of them came back over and were looking at the gardens, and they were pointing, saying, hey, I planted that one. I planted that one. So that was kind of nice. But a lot of schools have bought kits from us, and all over the United States. And it's a method of teaching not only horticulture and stuff. You also learn geometry. You learn history. You learn science. I mean, there's just a whole lot to it that you can teach with a keyhole garden. And it's getting back to nature. That's extremely important, I think. If a person learns how to grow crops, then, if the world ended up in a huge disaster, they would have that ability and know what they were talking about and know what to do. I don't expect that to ever happen, but it's good to know that it's kind of like riding a bicycle. You learn to ride a bicycle, then you pretty much learn it for life.
Right.
It's that type of experience. But for the older person, it's just the perfect way to raise crops, because you don't have to bend over as much, and the weeding is not that difficult. Occasionally you'll get some weeds in one, especially like from bird droppings and things like that. But there's very little weeding involved. And I don't know, I think it's perfect for an older person.
Share a couple of enjoyable stories, if you could, about people who've taken on keyhole gardening and some of the surprises perhaps they have experienced.
Yeah. Well, I know that like with our gardens, the majority of our customers tend to be, would be called senior citizens. And I do know that they send me photographs and things of what they raise, and they're just as surprised as I am when I get my crops going real good, and they're real satisfied. And I have a whole lot of repeat customers. Somebody might buy a garden kit or two and then come back the next year and buy a couple more, and the next year buy a couple of more. That happens a lot. But I think when I've talked to different garden clubs and groups, that they show me their gardens and they're just thrilled to death. So I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Now, you were mentioning earlier about how people can find out more about keyhole gardening. Perhaps they might want to decide to get a hold of a kit. How do they go about doing that?
The best way is to just log on to our website, keyholefarm.com, and just look over the site. You can see photographs of our plants and our crops, and we do experiments all the time. Those are detailed in there, and there's a place you can order if you want to. If you wanted to order a kit or two or whatever, it takes you to another site. But that's the best way to look it over. But I encourage people to go to our site and just look at the photographs we have and some of the stories about what we're doing now, what we're experimenting with now, and kind of get into it.
Yeah, after all, you can listen to so many stories, but until you actually have the experience, you'll never know until you actually engage in that process, the excitement of doing something like this.
Yeah, there's just a lot of joy in watching the crops grow, but also there is in watching the butterflies, learning to deal with the bees. Bees are your friends, and seeing they come out earlier in the morning usually, like here, and then wasps and yellow jackets come out in the afternoon when it's hot. But one thing I do is I'll try to raise, for instance, real tall, maximum size sunflowers. Now, some people consider sunflowers weeds, but the head of the sunflower has seeds that grow in it. And I try to get to the tall type for several reasons. One is yellow is my favorite color. Another reason is they attract bees, and you need bees to, do their pollinating and stuff. And another reason is birds tend to go up to where the sunflower heads are, and they'll pick the seeds off. And they tend to avoid my tomatoes more by doing that. So that's another reason I try to raise the sunflowers like that. It's like they're up there, and they're eating these sunflower seeds, and then they look down, they see some juicy red tomatoes, and say, "Gosh, I could have had a piece of tomato."
Interesting stuff. Well, thank you so much for being on the program today and sharing this with our listeners here. Again, how can they find out more about Keyhole Gardens?
Just go to our website, keyholefarm.com, KeyholeFarm.com. And there's just an abundance of material on there.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the program and sharing this with our listeners.
Gladly. Nice talking to you.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, you can find out more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.